So as you heard, Matt and Peter here. I'm an acoustic and audiovisual consultant with Arup, which is a big building engineering company. A little more known in the AE world than the AV world sometimes. But here with Peter, architect, founding partner at Bureau V. We know each other because we worked on the design of the venue National Sawdust together. Peter was the architect and I was the acoustic and audiovisual consultant. And so National Sawdust is an interesting venue that I think is going to apply to some other spaces, so we can kind of get into that a little bit.
Yeah, so I sort of actually serve a dual role because my studio, Bureau V, designed the building, but also I currently sit as a member of the board of directors of the nonprofit. So National Sawdust is a nonprofit music venue dedicated to discovery. So its main mission is to find up-and-coming musicians, composers, and other artists, and try to help them get their career along. So sort of before the moment where they're starting to actually make a sustainable level of monetization of their artistry. So with that mission, I think there's quite a few things that we're going to talk about today. I think the first of which is, who is that artist? And Matt, I'm sort of curious your thoughts in terms of what is the musical artist's landscape as of today?
Yeah, so National Sawdust is a space for music. I think one of the things that has been most interesting about how National Sawdust has developed in the 2-3 years that it's been open now is how many of the musicians are no longer content with being exclusively musical artists. I think they seem to be branching out and doing a lot more visual work, whether that's through collaborations or whether they're needing to become more skilled themselves in what they're branching out into and doing their own video work. That's one big part.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the modern musician, as we see it, one, they really do cross a lot of genre boundary lines, both in terms of instrumentation, right? We are a nonprofit, so in that sense, we often support quite a few things that might come out of a kind of post-conservatory world, but as well as things that are more, we have hip-hop artists. On one night, you'll see an a cappella group singing 17th century choral music, and the next night there'll be a drone metal show. So there is quite a big gamut that this space will actually support.
Yeah, and National Sawdust, I liked what you said there. It's kind of like the post-conservatory space, right? So these are kids that are studying music at Juilliard and other spaces. And so they're part of the classical music world, if you will, or the Western art music world. Instead of really sticking strictly to those boundaries, those traditional instruments and the traditional forms that the music's composed and played in, they're really branching out and including things like hip-hop, electronic music, that sort of thing.
So just for an example, on the left in this image is Helga Davis. So she is a vocalist, but also she is a radio personality. She has performed in Philip Glass operas, both in spoken word as well as sung. She's a composer. Here, for one of the opening nights last year for National Sawdust, she also teamed up with Reggie Rock of the Flexen Dancers. So this multi-artistry collaboration to develop this piece that was highly political and charged in National Sawdust. So just an example again of how the contemporary artist, as we're sort of seeing it, is not siloed in any sort of capacity in terms of genre, instrumentation, also their understanding of the need to bring in visual either in terms of actual technical video as well as spatially.
Yeah, and it's not just the artists that we've seen change when we've been seeing National Sawdust grow as a venue. It's, I think, also the audience to a fairly significant degree. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways that you can sort of see that. So at National Sawdust, one of the main missions that we also try to do, of course, is in supporting younger artists or those who are sort of coming into their own. One of the most vital things we can do is get them an audience of their peers. right? So people the same age who can now start to get interested in this artwork and support it for their entire lifetimes, basically. So this sort of peer audience is something that we're really focusing on at the National Sawdust. And part of that also is understanding an audience's sophistication. Obviously, a younger generation is much more interested in very specific, I think, experiences, both live performances. I mean, I think we all know that the recording industry, for instance, a recording now is really used as a promotional device as opposed to an economic engine. And I think that very much relates to the way audiences are absorbing this content as well and thinking through that they want something a little bit extra, right? So if the artist is going to make their money from live shows, a live show needs to be a little bit more than my favorite songs being played back to me, but something that pushes some sort of envelope a bit.
Yeah, and that ties into, there are those who've thought that we'd be doing a little bit less live venue attending less live shows, let's say. But I think when you look at National Sawdust, you'll see that they've been really raising the bar on the way that the audience interacts with the artist and are creating new things that keep people interested in showing up for the collective experience of the show.
So just for an example, the work you're seeing on the screen is from an opera director, R.B. Schlather. And so he started to make a name for himself by restaging mostly 16th and 17th century sort of oratorios in art galleries around downtown Manhattan. And so he became a resident in National Sawdust, was introduced to Philip Glass through National Sawdust, and then this is actually the magical opera of Philip Glass's that he staged in National Sawdust, where the instrumentation and the musicians are sort of kind of peppered through the room, and the audience therefore is then also equally integrated in that sense. And then the entire room is then projection mapped. So you can see that, as an opera director, something that we could see is this very, very classical kind of a role. He's taking to a much, much stranger and interesting level. We think, perhaps arrogantly, somewhat helped by the architecture. So I think in looking at this project, Matt, and our experience working on it together, how do you think some of the design choices that we made here address the question or the needs of the young artist?
Yeah, so I think, just from a very base perspective with looking at the technology, there is a lot for new and growing artists in the space, right? So the room has a fairly defined form, which you'll probably talk about more in a second, but it has an element of flexibility from a technological perspective that I think is really useful for a new space that can accommodate new types of works. So in this photo here of the venue, you can see that the staging is using a variable lift system. So you can set the stage up at different heights, different sections of stage, so you can have smaller stages, larger stages, and that really helps to tailor the space to the kind of events that you're having. You can also see that there's a lot of other technology, theatrical lighting, and probably most interesting, the sound and video system for those of us who are here. And the sound system is a very fixed tool in some respects in National Sawdust. It's a dead hang loudspeaker rig, 3-cluster rig, but there is a lot of infrastructure behind the walls that allows them to do new and different stuff whenever they need to do it. So tie lines going throughout the facility, allowing you to bring in speakers on sticks, speakers mounted onto the channel system. And yeah, maybe that's actually the more interesting thing here. So you see a lot of that technology in the room. It's not really hiding, but it has been collected into the architectural finished channel system of the room. And that helps just from a logical perspective so that people can understand how to use the space a little bit to encourage that. But it also keeps the space looking fairly consistent.
Yeah, I think one of the big decisions that we made in designing the space and trying to assess the needs of a young artist is that if National Sawdust is doing their job correctly, you're going to come to the venue on any given night and you're going to hear something amazing that you most likely have never heard before. And that focus on discovery obviously presents some problems, right? So you may not be able to fill the room. And so one of the things that we really tried to focus on, as you can see in this image, it's an intimate space. It's roughly 30 by 50 feet. The piano gives you a fair amount of scale with a balcony that sits sort of outside of that envelope. And the reason for this was that we wanted the space, whether 250 people show up or 40 people show up, it still feels like a real event. We actually have modeled this after, so in sort of looking to the future of what we think the young artist really wants to be able to use in a performance space, we actually look back to these 18th century models and the chamber hall model. So the room is roughly the size of one of the rooms at Esterhazy, which is the sort of Hungarian answer to Versailles, where late in life Haydn actually composed a bunch of his works. And what was really sort of fascinating about that particular moment, despite all of its economic and class issues, was that a composer could rehearse a piece, write that piece, and then premiere that piece all in the same room. So when we think about traveling performances, artists making all of their money off of lots of different performances in every single city, this is a real antithesis to that. And we wanted to do that really purposefully. So when you're a resident here, you both rehearse in the same room, you have an opportunity to record in that same room, so that's the sort of 20th century addition to the chamber hall model, and trying to retool this really as an incubator, and in the fullest San Francisco sense of the term, technologically rich, as well as something that's really looking towards the future and how we can get these musicians heard.
So if Esterhazy and everyone from that era were kind of a patronage system, what are we replacing it with? It's
a good question. So one of the main things is that this is a brand new startup nonprofit. So raising the capital was a really interesting project in and of itself. And in the end, what we've actually created, we haven't created a venue that has this concert hall, this second concert hall, multiple different rehearsal rooms, green rooms, and all of this. It's literally just one room. And what is really nice about that is it does have this very democratizing aspect to it. Granted, there's a wild issue that we will have with scheduling in terms of making sure everything fits and everybody gets into the room when they need to get into it. But whether you're an organization like Brooklyn Rider, this very well-known and highly skilled string quartet, or you're somebody who is working in Brooklyn and just figured something out and came into the summer labs that we do in August, and you're two people just trying a new project, you all use the same room. And we think there's something super democratizing about that. And it is a nonprofit space as well, so all of the funding and revenue streams and all of this goes back into supporting the artists. So in that sense, we're actually using this real estate and the money that's going into it to getting new voices heard, as opposed to pleasing the landed gentry.
Yeah. So if we're trying to provide a space that allows people room to grow, that means that they're going to need change. The space is going to have to change with them. How do you feel that we reconciled the need to be able to change and break things with the architecture of the space, the kind of fixed visual aesthetic of the space?
So I think one of the things we were worried about in the project was that when you design multi-use spaces, you kind of want the room to do everything. And at a certain point, we said that we're going to make it do a lot of things, but not everything. So we are going to actually locate a stage somewhere, even though it can disappear. And we did that along the long side of the room, actually, which is more in line with a lot of the 18th century chamber halls for a number of reasons, so you could be sort of close to it. But another big important aspect about this that you saw was the visual representation of the room. It's an assertive space. You're entirely surrounded by white. When the lights go down, it does not disappear. And that was very purposeful. And I think part of that was perhaps nostalgic in the sense of trying to go back and figuring out how do we then bring in that kind of nuance and artistry of an 18th century space into a 21st century paradigm. But the other side to it was that we wanted a room that was memorable, right? So if you're coming in off of this, so the exterior of the building is actually just an old factory that we wanted to keep. And we wanted that kind of approachability of a post-industrial art space that any major city across the world is familiar with. But as you go in, there's a change, a big shift, and something that will actually prompt you to think through like, oh, wait, I might experience something really interesting in this space. And the other side to it, too, is that it, I think, for better or for worse, has really challenged some of the artists to think about how to use a room like this one. So one of the things we've really tried to ask artists is to not simply just develop their artwork but do something specific to this space and use the backdrop of this room, use its size to create and help us establish even identity for ourselves in your own artwork that will then go in and help to pay forward getting more and more artists heard. So the sort of cynical side of that is that a number of the artists that we've supported, if you search them under a Google image, this backdrop appears behind them quite a few times. But the other side to it too is, some of the work that people have done in it, like the projection mappings of RB, or I think we have quite a few other ones. So here's a section too, just sort of showing about the size of it and the panel system. But I want to get, but yeah, you can see that, when the stage lights go on and the house lights go down, you're still in this room. And I think there's a way also that we wanted to have that design aspect, maybe have you have a little bit more contemplative thought about this, in the sense that it's not a black box where everything disappears. You're still in a room with some people listening to some music, and it is just this room. And so that intimacy, I think, was a real part of the design and making it remain.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a certain honesty about not eliminating the room. If we're going out of our way to share a space with other people, we're leaving our homes, leaving our TVs and our headphones, and we're going out, there's a certain honesty about not totally blacking out the space that you're going into and trying to remove yourself from the real and physical space. If you keep yourself in the room, you keep yourself, sharing an experience with multiple people instead of having some kind of optimized individual experience.
Definitely. So I guess maybe, Matt, in thinking through some of the things that we've learned from this process, what would you say for the need for either a small space or other spaces like this one, and the way that the technology is either really contributed to it, and what are sort of the positive aspects of this, and what might be something that you would think about in a different way after working on this project?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the need for multi-purpose spaces, but I think while we're trying to figure out who new audiences are for new types of performance, that we should be biting off less than we can chew to a certain extent. We should be designing more small venues that can be one or two things to a certain group of people, and we should allow that group to grow. What I've seen, I've seen a lot of 40-person shows at National Sawdust that were very intimate and very appropriate, and they didn't feel understuffed into the space. And I think that's positive for the creative process for the folks that are making their works in there. From a technology point of view, I might say the same thing. Design spaces with what they can afford for now, even if it's not everything. Anticipate that they're going to grow into it, and let them change over time. So rather than have those significant capital outlays at the front when you're opening up a new space like this, maybe assume that we don't know how it's going to grow over time, and that we need to plan for that change over the medium term.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the things that we've started to see from the project, so the opening night was October 2015, so it's been about 2.5 years.
Wow.
Since the project has been around. And one of the things that has been really interesting to see is that since the design is assertive, and it is this small space, and it does have this level of idiosyncrasy, one of the things we wanted to see is whether artists really hated this or whether it's something that they started to like. And it definitely has caused some sandpaper, and I think some of that is great. But there have been some really interesting ones too. We, as a nonprofit, do engage with more well-known artists, but always in the extent that we either ask you to curate and bring in some artists that you think we should hear, so using your fame to help support the careers of the next wave of musicians. Or if you're going to perform in the space, do something that you haven't done somewhere else. So for instance, just a few months ago, we had Fortet actually do a series of performances in the space. And it's such an intimate one that he had to do 4 shows. And to do that, he actually turned the entire room into these glowing rig of 3-dimensional LED frames that are all hanging from the ceiling, that are, of course, all timed and integrated into the overall performance. So we made this sort of volumetric, spatial light music piece. And it was at least a nice feeling for us, too, that an artist that is very well respected and very well known when he played in New York wanted to play here. And so I think in that sense, the idiosyncrasy of the space was a really big positive, and we're seeing more and more that a small, intimate space that looks weird can be really, really a good thing for the industry as well as the city.